Hello, everybody, and welcome to a video about the Star Wars Unlimited trading card game. My name is Nicolai, and I am a longtime Magic the Gathering player, but recently I got the chance to play in a Star Wars Unlimited sealed event. I won some packs, no big deal. But I got a chance to play the card game, and I figured I would make this video to share my perspective on it as a Magic the Gathering player. So if you play Magic and are considering trying Star Wars Unlimited, you'll have a point of reference and maybe have an understanding of how the game looks, so you can decide whether or not you want to try it out. Now, I'm not going to be explaining all of the rules of the game because, quite frankly, I probably don't know them well enough to do a great job doing that, but I will be explaining the general concepts and the way the game works from the perspective of using Magic terminology, and I'll probably sprinkle in some Hearthstone terminology here as well because the game does have some similarities to Hearthstone as well. But hopefully you'll get a good sense of how the game plays out for informing your decision on whether or not to play as well. I want to preface this by saying that I did have a lot of fun playing. I played sealed. It was a great time. I love Star Wars. I think Star Wars characters are cool. So just getting to play with Star Wars things is a lot of fun. And right off the bat, if you like Star Wars and you like card games, you're probably going to enjoy playing this one, at least like trying it out a couple times. So first off, I'm just going to throw that out there. I really enjoyed Star Wars. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I get to play with like all these cool cards from Star Wars. And this is really cool. I got to play with like Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan and all this cool stuff, which in and of itself is very satisfying. But I'll start breaking down the gameplay a little bit more in depth now so you can make a more informed choice. The gameplay is quite distinct from Magic the Gathering, but it does have some similarities. So for example, every turn you get to play a card from your hand face down as a mana. So you can like build up over the course of the game. There's that scaling thing where you start off doing relatively weak plays and you start doing more and more powerful things as the game goes on. However, unlike Magic the Gathering, you can play any card from your hand as a mana. So every turn you like draw 2 cards, and then you have the option of banking one of the cards from your hand as a mana, and then it's just a mana for the rest of the game. It can tap for any of your colors, and it just acts as a resource. So right off the bat, the mana system is a lot smoother, leads to some interesting decisions on whether or not you want to bank some of your late game spells in the early turns or whether you want to save them so you can actually cast them, which is something that I found very interesting, especially in the context of sealed, where maybe I only had a couple of really good late game cards and I didn't want to necessarily put them away in the early turns because I wanted to still have access to them later. But still, it's a very interesting where you always have access to the smooth mana. You're always going to be able to deploy your cards on curve and curve up and cast your more powerful spells when you want to on time. So that is an interesting change from Magic the Gathering, and I think one that, especially for noob card game players, are really going to make the game more fun to play, because you don't have those frustrating non-games where it feels like you didn't get to do anything. And because you're drawing 2 cards every turn, you get to see a lot of the cards in your deck, so you can really like formulate a strategy and curve out a little bit more consistently. Now, I could see this being a bit of a downside in the like long run if you really wanted to play this game a ton, because one of the things about the Magic the Gathering mana system is because some games you're going to have less lands and some games you're going to have more lands, it leads to like unique decision making where like, okay, I have a lot of lands, so I need to try to get every ounce of value from my spells this game. Or some games you have very few lands, so you just need to play your spells willy-nilly to survive and then eventually take over once you hit your lands. And that sort of diversity in gameplay really can make Magic very replayable, whereas in this game, it's going to be like, okay, I'm consistently curving out every single game, which is in and of itself very satisfying because curving out is nice, but it is something that I wanted to note because I don't think it's all upside, because the mana system in Magic the Gathering was created like this for a reason, and I think it's just an interesting difference between the two games. Another thing that I think is very interesting about the Star Wars Unlimited gameplay experience is it is not turn-based in the same way that Magic the Gathering is. In Star Wars Unlimited, you alternate who takes action, so it'll be like, okay, I take an action, which is like, I can play a spell, I can do an attack, I can do these like various actions, and then your opponent gets to do that. And then once you have no more actions to do, you can claim the initiative, which means you'll get to take the first action of the next turn cycle, which can be very, very valuable and leads to a little bit of a game of chicken sometimes, because once your opponent claims the initiative, you can kind of just keep doing whatever you want without them being able to react because they've claimed the initiative. It also leads to a bit of a game of chicken because you don't have to claim the initiative. You can just pass the turn and be like, okay, you can do whatever you want. And after you do something, I will then get to like respond to it essentially. But then your opponent can be like, well, if they're going to do this, I'm just going to like claim the initiative or whatever the thing ends up being. So it's kind of an interesting game of cat and mouse of like, okay, I need to do these things first because they're the most important, because my opponent's going to get to interact at the same time, which I think is a big difference from Magic, where it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to do my big thing, and then you're going to do your big thing, and then I'm going to do mine. And there's some instant speed stuff, so you can interact on your opponent's turn, but largely it's turn-based, which this game is turn-based, but the turns are like one action, one action, one action, one action, which felt really, really fun because it felt like everyone was engaged in the game the entire time. It's like, okay, what's my opponent going to do if I do this? What's my opponent going to do this? Oh, there's a new development. I need to do this now, which really made the game a lot of fun. So I think that's a cool thing as well. You don't have to feel like checked out when it's your opponent's turn. You get to like be constantly engaged, which I think is a great strength of this game as well. Next up, I want to talk about combat, because combat is probably maybe the way this game is most unique from Magic the Gathering. I mean, the turn-based thing is pretty different, but the combat system really resembles Hearthstone a lot more closely. For starters, creatures keep damage on them, so like your high toughness creatures get a lot more value because low toughness guys are just going to die off as soon as they do anything, whereas high toughness things can like stick around for a while, have some damage on them. And also, speaking of damage on creatures, you attack, and you can attack whatever you want. You can attack your opponent, you can attack their creatures. So if you say have like a 4/4 creature, you can attack it into your opponent's 3/3 and take it out, and your 4/4 will get 3 damage on it, but your opponent will no longer have that 3/3, which means that you kind of like can win these board states and just like slowly like build up a board state where like you have creatures with a little bit of damage on them, and then you can make favorable trades if you can control the board state. So that's really interesting. Now there are cards called sentries that can like force your opponent to attack them, which is quite powerful because then it reduces your opponent's options. But fundamentally, the game is like, okay, I can attack kind of wherever I want, which is really interesting. There is kind of a limit on where you can attack those sometimes because there's 2 battlefields going on at the same time. So in typical Star Wars fashion, while the space people are doing their thing, there's also the people on the ground. So if you've ever watched Star Wars Episode 6, it's kind of like when Lando Calrissian is leading the assault on the Death Star, and like Han Solo and Luke and Leia are kind of on, like, I guess Luke isn't there at the time, but like Han Solo and Leia are down on Endor, like doing the ground stuff. That's kind of how this game works as well, where there's like a space battlefield and a ground battlefield, where the ground battlefield, you kind of have like your soldiers, your Jedis, your things like that. And then the space battlefield, of course, has spaceships, and they can't really interact with each other very much. And so you're just like, okay, you can control the ground, you control space. And I think that actually leads to some pretty interesting deck building as well, where it's like, okay, I don't have a lot of space cards. So when I do have the space cards, maybe I can't afford to bank them as resources because I need to be able to actually play something in space so my opponent can't just like kill me with their ships. Or similarly, you can like make sure you can control both realms at the same time, which leads to some interesting play and counterplay. And I think in Constructed, it seems like an interesting deck building puzzle as well, to be like, okay, how many spaceships do I want? How many ground things do I want? And things of that nature. The final thing I want to say about the kind of gameplay of like developing your creatures is you have a leader, and your leader determines what colors you can play. There's like a leader and a base, and that like determines your color combinations and like what spells you can play. You can play spells off color, but they like cost more mana. But the leader is very important because you gain access to your leader as like a special spell that you can play. They have like extra abilities as well, but first of all, you gain like the ability of your leader, but also you get to deploy them as a creature at some point during the course of the game into the ground arena once you reach a certain mana threshold. And that's like a really, once again, kind of a powerful consistency thing where it's like, okay, I can always hit my land drops and I always get to play my leader on this turn. So you can really plan for it, and your opponent can plan for it. And just like as a matchup thing, it's like, okay, I know my opponent's going to probably curve out and then play their leader on this turn. And that's just something you can plan for the entire time. And it's like, okay, my opponent's leader has this effect that's kind of like a passive ability that they can use the entire game. And so I'm going to try to respond to that and interact with that as well. And I think that's really an interesting element of the gameplay that kind of feels a little bit like Hearthstone, where in Hearthstone, every hero has a hero power that they can use, and you kind of play around that. But this one's like you get your hero power from your hero, and then you also get to deploy them as a threat, which is pretty fun. I found it to be very satisfying because my hero was Luke Skywalker when I was playing. So be like, okay, I reached this threshold and boom, Luke is coming into the fray. He's going to help me win. And that was really fun as well. So I think that's a really interesting aspect where it adds to the consistency, potentially makes replayability a little bit like less fun because like, okay, he got to turn 6 and he played Luke Skywalker again, or kind of like that. But it is kind of a nice little thing that you can build your deck around, in effect, almost like in Commander for Magic the Gathering, where you know you'll always have access to your commander, so you can build a deck around a certain type of effect, which I think is really cool. And I think it adds to a lot. It makes the game feel very distinct and also feel very Star Warsy, because if you really like a Star Wars character, you can build a deck around them if they are one of the leaders that has currently been made. So that was my kind of take on the gameplay, the way that it felt to like play, the way that it felt to like build your decks. I think the gameplay was actually very enjoyable. where it felt like if you had the ability to plan several turns in advance, line things up a little bit better, that you could probably like get an advantage over your opponent. So I think like a better player will probably beat like a weaker player a significant portion of the time, just because they have a better understanding of how to line up their attacks with like the creature, so that you can like control the board state. Because that's the sort of thing that if you played a lot of card games, it's kind of intuitive. Like, okay, I want to make sure I have as many things on the board as possible so I can line up my attacks properly. Which, if you're that sort of mind, it really can be quite enjoyable, and I found very satisfying. I was playing at an event where basically nobody had played before, so like my experience with card games in the past gave me a little bit of an advantage, where it was like, okay, I know that these are the sorts of things I want to do, because this is like controlling the board state is really important, and I want to do these things and these things to make sure that I have the most creatures in play and can really just like maintain this board advantage. And so I think that's like a really satisfying part of the game. I do wonder though, if at like once everybody's good at it, if it's just like, okay, obviously they're going to do these things, because like alternating back and forth, you kind of have like, okay, he's going to like attack his 3/3 and my 2/2, and he just controls the board, and then I'm just like kind of suffering for a little bit of the game. So like once you get to the higher levels, because the gameplay, as I said, plays out very smooth, if everyone kind of knows what's going on, I wonder if there is as much like, oh, I'm going to be able to outplay my opponent, because it feels like there might be a little bit less of that. Though, I mean, players get really good at games, and so I'm sure there's still going to be some advantage to be gained in deck building or things like that, especially because of the turn-based nature, where you get so many decisions on like not only what you do, but when you prioritize it in your turn, because maybe you're planning on attacking with one of your creatures and your opponent kills it before you get a chance to do that, and that's just an interesting thing to consider. Anyway, I hope this video gave you a little bit of insight into Star Wars Unlimited. I do recommend trying it out. As I said, if you like Star Wars, if you like card games, if you like a new challenge, I think it is a really interesting game, a really fun design, and combines a lot of aspects of various card games that I find very satisfying. So definitely something that you should check out if you do enjoy playing card games and learning something new. If you did make it all the way to the end of this video, leave hashtag first time Star Wars in the comment section down below to let me know that you made it, and maybe if you're going to give the game a try for the first time. But that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time. May the Force be with you.